Good evening and welcome. Delighted to see all of you here for this evening's event. And it's wonderful to be here in the library. I always find this to be a far more intimate and conducive space for the kind of conversation that we're going to be having this evening. What makes a good diplomat? It's a question that sounds deceptively simple at first. Society often imagines the diplomat as the one who stands at the forefront, delivering powerful speeches and wielding influence. But it is much more than that, as our students come to learn over the course of 4 years spent at GUQ. If you speak to those who have taught and lived diplomacy, and I'm honored to be introducing one of the finest in this regard, you will find that diplomacy is as much about listening as it is about speaking, as much about humility as it is about authority. And that is precisely why we are so fortunate to welcome our distinguished diplomat in residence, Ambassador Dimitri Alexandrakis, to shed light on this question. His journey began at this very institution, at Georgetown University, where he earned not one but 2 degrees. First, a bachelor's in foreign service, as many of you here will be getting, followed by a master's in government. His studies laid the groundwork for a career spanning over 42 years, across 4 continents, in the company of world leaders and in the service of Greece and the world. Whether he was navigating the complexities of Iran amid global tensions or engaging with Brazil during an economic surge while his own nation faced financial crisis, Ambassador Alexandrakis' approach reflects an unshakable commitment to connecting people, principles, and countries. In each posting, he has left a tangible mark. From Iran, where Greece became one of the first to donate vaccines on humanitarian grounds, to Zimbabwe, where he oversaw aid initiatives that reached refugee camps and clinics. He has shown that diplomacy goes beyond negotiation at the table to action in the field. And at the UN, where he managed Greece's involvement with Security Council affairs, his commitment to global cooperation shone through the countless crises and committee rooms he navigated. So as we gather to gain insights on statecraft from an ambassador who speaks 6 languages and has built connections on every continent, I encourage each of you to listen for the threads that tie us together, the ideals of service, compassion, and resilience that Ambassador Alexandrakis exemplifies. So with that, please join me in welcoming our distinguished diplomat in residence and Georgetown alumnus, Ambassador Dimitri Alexandrakis. Dimitri.
Good evening to all, and thank you for coming. I would like to especially thank Dean Massey for inviting me here, and also for his extremely generous words of introduction. As he said, I am a Hoya, so it gives me really real pleasure to be here. And I must say that my education at SFS was perfect preparation for my career afterwards as a diplomat. And I'm not saying that because I'm here. I'm saying it because I believe it. So during my 42 years in the foreign ministry, I was asked many times about the functions of a diplomat. I'm surprised by the number of people who don't really know what our work involves. So I would like here to describe the diplomat's functions and the qualities that any successful diplomat should have. I'm going to be turning many pages, don't worry. It's not a 2-hour speech, it's a large font. So, at the same time, I will give some examples from my own experience over the years, as well as my advice on diplomatic do's and don'ts. Maybe you know the famous phrase by Sir Henry Wotton, when he himself was sent on a diplomatic mission in 1604, that an ambassador is an honest man sent to lie abroad for the good of his country. But apart from being a clever witticism, this could not be further from the truth, for reasons I shall explain later. Fortunately, he does at least concede that diplomats are honest. Sir Ernest Sato's famous Guide to Diplomatic Practice, which in its updated form is still extremely useful today, describes diplomacy thus: diplomacy is the application of intelligence and tact to the conduct of official relations between the governments of independent states, or even more briefly, it is the conduct of business between states by peaceful means. And Sato makes a distinction which I believe to be of paramount importance. Diplomacy, he writes, has sometimes been made to appear as the equivalent of foreign policy. But foreign policy is formulated by the government, not by the diplomatist. This is the quote from Satov. So many people make this above confusion, whereas diplomacy is the implementation of foreign policy decided by governments, by politicians. We diplomats do not decide policy. We try to influence it with advice, opinions, even exhortation. But the decisions are taken by the ministers, by government. So let me now describe the main functions of a diplomat. I would break them down into 5 main functions, as in fact they have been defined in the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which governs these relations to this day. The first, and apparently most straightforward, is representation. An ambassador is a representative of his or her head of state to the head of state of another country. Most representative functions are ceremonial in nature and therefore may be quite boring. For example, having to listen to a series of speeches on a historical event. But I consider this function essential, since it shows respect to the country to which you are accredited. This is a minimum. You honor the country by going to its most important official events. In recent times, however, consideration of issues of substance can impinge upon the representative functions. For example, there are sometimes discussions within the European Union, EU, on whether the ambassadors of the member states should go to the inauguration of a president who we believe was elected in elections that were neither free nor fair. My position, and I know there's many colleagues of mine who disagree with me, but my position is that since we have diplomatic relations with the country in question, we should always go to the official inauguration ceremony. The position of the EU on the election itself, if we believe it is not fair, it's not free, etc., it can be publicized through various and multiple statements, including by the ambassador's own government, but not, in my view, by non-representation at the ceremony. That person will be the head of state of that country, whether we like it or not. There is also an element of inconsistency if one does not attend the inaugural ceremony. Why? Because an ambassador presents a letter of credence to the president. I should add that an ambassador is fully functional in a country only after the presentation of credentials to the head of state. So on the one hand, you present your credentials to the president, as you have to be fully functional. On the other hand, you don't attend the ceremonies hosted by that very same president. I have here 2 photos. Where is the... it's over there. So that's, well, myself. I had just presented my letters of credence to President Rouhani of the Islamic Republic of Iran in September 2017. He's reading them, and I'm waiting for the discussion to start. These are very official occasions, so the discussion is limited to 10, 15 minutes. And here, you see the recently appointed Norwegian ambassador presenting, this is the time to present exactly the credentials to the recently elected president of Iran, Pezeshkian. So my previous thinking also applies to attendance at National Day events. By the very fact alone that we are accredited to a country, we should attend that country's National Day celebration, regardless of whether we are unhappy with a particular policy of that country of the day. Attendance shows the minimum respect which I believe is required in bilateral relations. But in any case, you can see that something that appears as straightforward as a representational function is not always that simple. The second basic function is protecting in the receiving state, where the embassy is located, the interests of the sending state, your own country, and its nationals, within the limits permitted by international law. This is very wide and includes a whole range of activities. For example, ensuring that nationals are safe during natural disasters or protecting the economic and business interests of companies both big and small. It can also mean lodging démarches concerning sovereign rights, for example, in disputed waters. Therefore, diplomats' daily activities are very varied and often unpredictable, for example, if a national is imprisoned. As you can see from the above, the protection of a country's interests can range from high diplomacy concerning, for example, negotiations on sensitive subjects or involving diplomatic disputes between countries, to consular affairs affecting the citizens of that state. Consular affairs also concern nationals of the receiving state, for example, if they have commercial links or differences with an individual or a company of the sending state. It also concerns the issuing of visas. Visas are only a small part of a diplomat's duties and are usually carried out by junior consular officers. Ambassadors are very rarely involved in visa issues, and yet, many times the public believes that this is our main function, visas. When I was ambassador to Iran, for example, many of my friends during the pandemic shutdown thought that I had no work because we were not issuing visas. And obviously, during the pandemic, our work was far reduced. But there were new issues and challenges to deal with, precisely because of the pandemic. One important example, as Dean Massey already mentioned, was negotiating the donation of vaccines for humanitarian reasons to the Iranian Red Crescent through the Greek Ministry of Health. Greece donated a total of 350,000 vaccines. Here I am at the airport, Imam Khomeini International Airport in Tehran. The vaccines behind, and that's the Deputy Minister of Health with another colleague. He's pointing at the truck, the van of the Red Crescent, on which the vaccines will be loaded onto. The second photo, these are the vaccines. You can see more clearly the flags. The Greek flag, the Iranian flag, and the EU flag below. This required many hours of negotiation, both with my own authorities as well as the Iranian ones, on issues such as number of vaccines required, where manufactured. US vaccines were not accepted in Iran. So even if they were not US made, US company, if they were manufactured in the US, they did not accept them. So the expiration dates, mode of transportation, making sure that the vaccines would be officially delivered to the Iranian Red Crescent and not somewhere else. So this humanitarian gesture by the Greek government was important in more ways than one. First and foremost, it helped the Iranian people directly during these very difficult times. I should add here that the Iranians, they're very competent, in technology and so on. So very quickly, they had their own vaccines based on the Chinese ones. It was based on the Chinese technology. But when we donated the vaccines together with other countries, there was a real lack of vaccines. So it was a critical time for the donation. Secondly, our donation contributed to strengthening the ties between the two countries in a non-controversial way because it was a humanitarian gesture. To my knowledge, about 12 countries, including Qatar, donated anti-COVID vaccines. Their ambassadors were invited to the Ministry of Health in a ceremony where the minister thanked the countries for showing solidarity with Iran in the fight against the pandemic. So even though Greece is a small country, our humanitarian gesture went a long way. And, well, another slide. Here, we're at the Minister of Health, with the Minister of Health himself, the 12 countries that donated, and you can see the flags also, the flag of Qatar, and you can see the flag of Greece, among other flags as well. So let's move to the third main function, which is negotiating with the government of the receiving state. This function may be the most delicate and important, for example, when negotiating bilateral or multilateral treaties or declarations to be issued at international meetings. A good negotiator requires many skills, good knowledge of English, intelligence, tact, and above all, patience. You must persevere without losing your patience. And here I would like to underline a point which I think is of paramount importance. In a successful negotiation, both sides, or all sides as the case may be, must be satisfied with the outcome. It is a process of give and take. No side can only take. If one side only takes, it is an unsuccessful negotiation. Success requires compromise, a very important word. You don't compromise your principles, but you make compromises during negotiations so as to achieve the balance, to give in order to take what you need. So a treaty which is a zero-sum result or that is signed under duress is condemned to failure. In this case, the aggrieved side would seek revenge somewhere down the line, as history has shown. A very well-known example is the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, where all the blame for the First World War was put on Germany, whereas actually all the great powers of the day had part of the blame. But the blame was put on Germany, and the onerous terms of the treaty caused economic collapse in Germany and led to Hitler. So, as I said, the result of any negotiation must be win-win. The fourth function is ascertaining by all lawful means conditions and developments in the receiving state and reporting thereon to the government of the sending state. This is the permanent activity of all embassies, and it occupies more of our day than other activities. So you may think that in today's world, where everything is instantly available on the mobile phone, reporting by embassies is a luxury, not really needed. And of course, times have changed. But even when I entered the foreign ministry in 1980, one of our most respected ambassadors told me, you cannot beat the press in terms of speed, rapidity of information. He said that in 1980. So, the important thing is not the reporting, but how you do it. So the difference between the media and the diplomat is to provide analysis usually from the perspective of his or her own country's interests. That's what the diplomat does. I would like to stress that the difference is not because of skills or quality of reporting. It's because of the needs of their respective publics, so to speak. For journalists, it is basically everyone. Whereas for diplomats, it is their governments. And the ambassador's judgments, analyses, and predictions are always important to their authorities. So, yes, times have changed, but embassy reporting is still important for the reasons I mentioned. Our capitals, our authorities need to know what the ambassador is judging and what he's predicting. So furthermore, in order to understand developments in a country, a diplomat should attentively follow all the main media and cultivate contacts with people from all walks of life. If you have contacts only with government officials, you have the official line or point of view, but you will not have the overall picture unless you speak to opposition parties, academics, journalists, businessmen, artists, etc. A good ambassador will always cultivate as many contacts as possible in the whole of society, so as to have as many perspectives as possible. A mistake often done by diplomats is to ignore the opposition. And something more, in order to understand the country and its people, any good diplomat will delve into the culture of that country by learning about its history, literature, arts, etc. It is always a good idea to learn, or at least to make the effort to learn, the language of the country in which you are serving. This, apart from opening insights into the culture of the country, is always appreciated by its people. The fifth and probably most important function of an ambassador in the embassy team is to promote friendly relations between his or her own country and the country where he or she is posted in as many fields as possible: economic, cultural, scientific, political, arts, sports, etc. Most of the daily work of an embassy should be precisely in this area, promoting relations, through visits to ministers, universities, think tanks, and so on. The above 5 main functions are exactly that, the main ones, but don't worry, I'm not going to mention any more. But anyway, since I have described these main categories of an ambassador's daily work, what do you notice? In one phrase, get out of the office. Not in order to enjoy the best espresso in town, which unfortunately I've done many times, but that's another issue. It's to pursue contacts. Contacts, contacts, contacts. This is the best way to learn about the country's people, their concerns, their customs, and so on, as well as to promote the interests of your country and the goals of diplomacy in general. So, of course, we work many hours at the embassy in order to receive visitors and other colleagues, in order to write and read reports, and so forth, but contacts outside the embassy are also crucial. So let me now turn to the qualities necessary for the profession of a diplomat. Here I base myself not only on my experience, but also on Satov's Guide to Diplomatic Practice. I keep forgetting the slide. A vital work, which I mentioned already. And you will be very surprised that Satov himself bases his advice on the famous work de la manière de négocier avec les souverains. In English, on the manner of negotiating with sovereigns or the practice of diplomacy, written by the French diplomat François de Caillères in 1716. Yes, you heard me correctly, 1716. And his advice still has much to commend itself today, even though the style of diplomacy is less subtle and less complex than in those days. However much we may have computers, new techniques, AI, etc., human nature and national character have not changed. The insights, for example, of the ancient Greek philosophers and tragedians on human nature are still valid today. And people are vital elements in diplomacy. People. So some points of the advice given by Caillères. You should have an attentive spirit as well as a calm and patient nature. We said that already. This patience should also be reflected in one's responses. Sometimes you may need to examine an issue further or await instructions when negotiating. At the same time, a diplomat must also, according to the situation, take the opportunity offered at once. She or he should judge whether it is wiser to wait or wiser to act at that very moment. Again, judgment is paramount. And again, this shows the importance of your person on the spot, your representative in the field. However much communications are exceedingly fast, and to whatever extent ministers, prime ministers, presidents can speak directly to each other, many issues are dealt with and resolved during diplomacy's day-to-day activities. And of course, when presidents meet, the files and the talking points, all the preparation is done by a diplomat. And by the way, diplomats will be needed even when we are on Mars or the Moon, if ever we get there. So here, I will digress, and if I may, I will take an example from my father, who was the ambassador of Greece to the United States from August 1974 to August 1979. He was appointed immediately following the restoration of democracy in Greece in July 1974. Since this is such a long time ago, I should give some of the background. A reminder that Greece's 7-year military dictatorship collapsed following the attempted overthrow by the military junta of the legitimate president of Cyprus, Archbishop Makarios, and the subsequent invasion of the island by Turkey, which in fact is still controlling 37% is still occupying 37% of the territory of Cyprus. So this was a period of very high tension between Greece and Turkey, with the latter making military threats and violating Greek airspace over the Aegean Sea, which lies between Greece and Turkey. So in early 1976, my father, Menelaos Alexandrakis, saw the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in the foyer of a concert at the Kennedy Center in Washington. Of course, he had already visited the Secretary of State in the State Department, but he met him by chance at this concert at the Kennedy Center. And he expressed his concerns to Kissinger about continuing Turkish military activity in the Aegean. Kissinger replied that the US would not remain indifferent if Turkey tried to impose its views militarily, and reiterated the US conviction that disputes must be settled peacefully. Now here is the important point. My father could have just thanked Kissinger because this was an important reassurance and informed Athens. But what did he do at that very moment? He asked Kissinger if he could have these reassurances in writing. And Kissinger told him to call his office the next day. So that started a negotiation between Washington and Athens, which finished in the exchange of letters. And in his letter of reply, Kissinger to our foreign minister at the time, Dimitri Alexandrakis, in this letter, he states, and I quote, "Disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, and particularly in the Aegean area, must be settled through peaceful procedures, and each side should avoid provocative actions. Therefore, the United States would actively and unequivocally oppose either side is seeking a military solution and will make a major effort to prevent such a course of action." This was a real success because, as I said, it is one thing to have something orally, it is another thing to have it in writing. The letter gave significant reassurances to the Greek government and, more importantly, was vital in dissuading Turkey from taking military action against Greece. And all of this started at the chance meeting at the classical music concert. For the above account, I have mainly used the book Beyond Borders, 1974 to 1977, by Dimitri Alexandrakis, who was a Greek diplomat and our foreign minister during those years. The book, unfortunately, is available only in Greek. The text, however, of the Kissinger letter is available in English. It's in English in the appendix. My account is, of course, also based on what my father himself told me. So returning to the advice of Cayer, another important point is reciprocity. Every negotiation, as I mentioned earlier, is a give and take. Other qualities, you need to be honest. This is stated by Cayer. As Aristotle said, if you lie, you will not be believed when you speak the truth. So Henry Wotton was wrong. More advice, always listen more than talk. Maybe I'm talking too much, but soon I will be ending. But it's important to listen. So Cayer mentions the case of an ambassador who was so eager to prove his point that he gave away state secrets during the discussion. Another phrase of Cayer is the importance of une bonne table, a good table, so to speak, meaning to invite well. A humorous illustration is from the famous Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815, which followed the defeat of Napoleon and France by the other great powers. The French foreign minister, Talleyrand, was given very detailed instructions by his king, Louis XVIII, and he's supposed to have responded by saying, "I need more casseroles to make food than instructions." And indeed, lots of his success as a defeated party in Vienna was due to the sumptuous dinners he offered, because lots of the negotiations and lots of the points he succeeded in gaining were done at table or around the table during the informal events. And don't for one moment think that this is something of the past. Lots of the agreements at the UN, for example, are informally reached over lunch or in the corridors of the organization. They are then formalized in the sessions. Many times the sessions are very formal, official. You make a set statement and that's it. But to reach agreement, You do it in the corridors of the UN, and very often at lunch or over coffee, when things can be discussed freely between the diplomats. In a more relaxed atmosphere of lunch or dinner, especially between the ambassador and one or two interlocutors, more can be said, and very importantly, much more freely than within the four walls of ministries, where often you have note takers, for example, present. So there's very many possible qualities, but I just would like to mention two more which I think are very important. First, a good diplomat will always try to put herself or himself in the position of their interlocutor, their counterpart. Try to imagine what they would wish, do, and say under the same circumstances. It is essential to recognize that there exist other points of view. You may not agree with those other points of view, but you have to understand that there exist other points of view and why. This will also help your own argumentation. You must never be so full of your ideas and the eagerness to express them that you fail to notice the points made by your counterpart. Second is the need for humor. This helps to reduce tensions and make people feel more at ease. Of course, the humor or joke must be appropriate and made at the right moment. And don't forget, a diplomat is a diplomat 24 hours a day. A diplomat represents his or her country 24 hours a day. It's not office and then forget it. It's 24 hours a day. So let me give you two examples from my experience on how humor is always useful. One is a young diplomat at the embassy in Ankara, the other from when I was ambassador to Brazil. So in Turkey, where I was lucky enough to serve from 1983 to 1987, when people asked me where I was from, I used to reply in Turkish, "En iyi komşu," which means the best neighbor. So this immediately led to confusion, because at that time, Turkey's neighbors, the Soviet Union, Communist Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, Bulgaria, the newly established Islamic Republic of Iran, every day beaming Islamic propaganda into Turkey, Hafez Assad, Syria, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So then I explained that the only neighbor that did not ask anything from Turkey was Greece. The only thing we wanted of Turkey was to respect our territory and our sovereignty according to international accords and international law. So, but you see that with this way of introducing my country, I could make my point in a more relaxed atmosphere. And by the way, don't get me wrong about Turkey. It is our biggest and most important neighbor. And of course there are problems, but they are handled by dialogue between the two governments. The two governments make every effort to have friendly, cordial relations. And the people, the Turks and the Greeks, will get along famously well. So let's move to Brazil, where I was ambassador from 2009 to 2015. Following 2010, Greece went through a very serious financial crisis. Therefore, during many of my meetings with my interlocutors, journalists, etc., I used to explain the crisis. I did not try to justify the crisis, because it was clear that Greece and successive Greek governments had made very many mistakes. But I tried to explain it, setting it in the wider context of the euro crisis, because actually it was extremely unfair to point the finger only at one country, my country. So I put it in the wider context. Of course, there were many arguments. I will not bother with the details, but in one of my meetings, the Brazilian Deputy Minister of Commerce, he told me, yes, I know, but Greece has a very serious corruption problem. I accepted that. I said, yes, we do, and it's a problem that we have to tackle. And then I added casually that, as you know, Brazil is below Greece in the Transparency International Corruption Index. The Transparency International Corruption Index is published annually, and country number 1 is the best, it's the least corrupt. So I told him that, as you know, Brazil is below Greece in the table. He was so surprised. He looked at me and said, where is Brazil? And I told him 128th. And where is Greece? 125th. So, so obviously he laughed. But I had made my point that people in glass houses should not throw stones. And by the way, I checked, and now we are 59th. So we're not that good, but we have made significant progress. So the final section, just a few examples of where diplomacy was successful and where diplomacy failed. Especially the one where the missed opportunity, I think, is interesting. It goes back to September 11, 2001, and I'm relying mainly on the book Revolutionary Iran, A History of the Islamic Republic by Michael Axworthy. After 9/11, for once, at least initially, so-called hardliners or conservatives and so-called reformists or moderates in Iran were united. Supreme Leader Khamenei and then President Khatami condemned the attacks on the World Trade Center in the strongest terms. And ordinary Iranians went onto the streets and lit candles in spontaneous demonstrations of support to the US. When it emerged that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan were the perpetrators of the terrorist attacks, some in both Washington, D.C. and Tehran noticed that there was a coincidence of interest and maybe some opportunity to improve relations. Just to explain, the Taliban had attacked the Iranian consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif in Afghanistan and killed 11 Iranians. And lots of the Al-Qaeda fighters had sectarian hatred of Shias. So when America began the operations against Afghanistan, Iran helped. These are the important points. First and foremost, the Islamic Republic of Iran gave permission for overflights by US aircraft. Can you imagine? US aircraft flying over the territory of the Islamic Republic. At the same time, Iranian and American diplomats were meeting at hotels in Geneva and Paris, all through this period. At least 2 Al-Qaeda fugitives were handed back to the States by Iran through Afghanistan. They were given to US hands in Afghanistan. And the Iranians also provided the passports of 200 Afghan fighters to the US. So during this period, Iran had assisted the US in concrete ways, not only in declarations, in concrete ways. So official Iran expected some reward from the American side, maybe in trade relations, maybe some advance in the bilateral relations, what I mentioned earlier about give and take. But no, do you remember what Iran received in return? In then President Bush's State of the Union speech in January 2002, just a few months following the start of US operations in Afghanistan, Iran was included in the so-called Axis of Evil, together with Iraq and North Korea. Within Iran, this Axis of Evil speech was seen as a direct slap in the face of President Khatami, a moderate, and reinforced the hardliners' position on the US and the West, namely that they cannot be trusted, the US and the West cannot be trusted, and that Iran should make no further efforts in this direction. So months of diplomatic efforts came to nothing. It seems that this Axis of Evil term and this speech was made by some junior speechwriter in the National Security Council, and obviously I think there was some lack of coordination within the administration. And there are, unfortunately, countless examples of failed diplomacy or more often missed opportunities in diplomacy. There is too much shouting. We see it these days, too much accusations, too much groupthink. Everyone is thinking the same thing and no one dares say something else. Too many pigeonholes. We don't think outside the box. So diplomacy many times is not given the chance to work. But we do have examples of successful diplomacy, of course, many. A recent example is of successful short-term diplomacy, and I'm mentioning it because it was tough negotiations. It was a prisoner swap agreed among the US and Russia and other countries, which took place in Ankara, Turkey. This happened last August, so we still need time, I think, for the details. But the fact remains that this exchange, while also controversial, benefited many families on all sides And what is important that the tensions between the US and Russia were at an extremely high level because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But yet, the two sides on this issue found space for diplomacy. For diplomacy to work, there must always be the necessary political will. So that's why I think that's an important example, because it shows that even in the worst circumstances, there is space for diplomacy. For long-term success, there is the example of Kissinger, of Nixon Kissinger opening to China, as described in Kissinger's book Diplomacy. Another example of long-term success is in Graham Allison's book Destined for War, where he talks about the Thucydides trap, where the ruling country, the ruling power, is afraid of the rising power, and if the proper measures are not taken, war results, as happened in ancient Greece between Athens and Sparta. And Allison, it's interesting to note, says the main example, what does he says, he quotes, one of history's greatest escapes in escaping Thucydides' trap is, believe it or not, the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Why? Because they pursued a competition outside of armed conflict, and the two powers managed the high-stakes, great power competition in history. They avoided nuclear war. One reason was, of course, the doctrine MAD, mutually assured destruction. The second reason why war was avoided was a culture of cooperation through diplomacy and negotiation. There were many negotiations and agreements on limitation of all types of military weapons. All this process was called jaw-jaw, not war-war. So when diplomacy reigns supreme, war is avoided and everyone gains. And the reason why I think the Cold War is a good example is it's not a perfect example, because there were very many, unfortunately, proxy wars in Korea, in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, and elsewhere. But war between the two major powers, which could have led to devastation on a global scale, was avoided. So that's why I think it's a good example, because it shows that diplomacy is a process lasting sometimes over many years, requiring patience and perseverance. There may be quick successes, but you have to build on these successes in order to have a succession of successes. I should add here just a point of information that Greece was elected as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, the UN Security Council, for 2025 and 2026. And the Greek program highlights democracy, dialogue, and diplomacy. But after all I have said, how can I conclude? As already stated, an ambassador should try to combine the fullest possible understanding and even sympathy with the country in which he or she is serving, with a steady awareness of his or her country's interests. Like everything else in life, this requires balance. It seems to me, however, that in many respects the world is off balance. Too much war with too little space given to diplomacy. And war is not, in the famous phrase of the Prussian General Clausewitz, the continuation of policy by the means. No, it is the failure of politics, a failure to exhaust all diplomatic means to avoid conflict. Why? Because the necessary political will is lacking. So we need to change this balance. Less resort to violence, less resort to war, more talk, more dialogue, more negotiation. After all, the all-embracing goal of diplomacy is peace in the world. Thank you. I think now I've been instructed to sit here and take questions. Please.
Thank you, Russell. I have a question. So you mentioned the successful diplomacy. One example is the Nixon's opening to China.
Yes.
And I have a question. So then you already mentioned that the decision making is made by government, not by the diplomats and ambassadors. So what kind of the roles that in ambassador and diplomats can do in this good diplomacy in this circumstance?
Well, exactly that. Lots of the negotiation was done by diplomats. Of course, the top-level negotiation was Kissinger and Nixon with their counterparts in China. It was Zhou Enlai and others. But the day-to-day work and the negotiations with the instructions by their bosses were done by the diplomats. It wasn't an easy process. It took a number of years. So it wasn't every time the negotiations at the high level. It was at the lower level between ambassadors. It was not the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister.
Okay, can I imagine that the negotiations you mentioned will be the scenarios like, for example, I were an ambassador in the States and I will talk to the ambassador in China to say like so since our President Nixon said we're gonna have opened the market for China, so next year we're gonna increase our trade quota from 0 to 10 or something like this. Is it the negotiations you mean?
No, but it cannot be done overnight. It takes time. This is what I think I was I was trying to explain. All of this is a process, and you need patience and time. So it's not been done over. You can make the proposals, but for them to be accepted, to remove all tariffs, for example, it's a process that first of all has to be agreed among the parties, and many times the decisions or the result of the negotiation has to be also passed through Congress, for example, if it concerns America. So it's not easy. And another role for diplomats, because when an issue goes to the Congress, lots of the explanation of why, for example, an agreement is in the interest of the US is done by the diplomats who have handled these negotiations.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I'm very appreciated the speech you did today. Thank you so much.
Very kind of you. And I would like also to thank actually senior student Arisha Fatima, because she helped me enormously with typing and the computer technicalities, which unfortunately I'm not good at all. So thank you very much, Arisha. Please.
I have a question regarding your outlook on digital diplomacy.
Yes.
What do you think about it? And how do you maintain 24/7 availability at your career for so many years? How do you maintain health and safety? And do you have any examples of the mistakes that you've...
My mistakes?
Yes.
Oh, too many. I prefer not to tell them.
Thank you.
But your first question I don't sure I understood.
Digital diplomacy?
This means what exactly?
It means at the modern age, like we use AI and we use...
Yes. So there is this, but it's not enough, because the most important element in everything is a human being. However much, many times people think you... Thank you very much, thank you. So you put things through a computer, whoop, the answer comes out. No, it's not like that, The human element from ancient times is the most important. So these are very important. I'm not denying it. Computers, AI are very important, and they will, I hope, help mankind much more than be a problem. But for diplomacy, as for everything else, it is not enough, because everything comes down to the human being. So, but mistakes were like...
And regarding your health maintenance and safety as well, thank you.
Well, as concerns safety, I'm lucky that we're a small, non-controversial country, so there isn't really, other countries, some ambassadors, they cannot circulate by themselves. I could leave as an ambassador, because as a young diplomat, no problem, but as an ambassador, I could leave and walk wherever I wanted. Whereas, for example, the US ambassador always had to be accompanied, no privacy, and some other countries as well. So, but for smaller countries, I think it's not a problem. Of course, safety is an issue. In Brazil, for example, supposedly you're not supposed to go out after 6 in the evening, walking, only take taxi and car. But I did walk many times at midnight and after midnight in Lapa, as some of my Brazilian friends here may know. So I think the safety is more an issue of, for most countries, more an issue of just simply common sense and taking care of yourself. Thank you. You're from where? Which is your country? Russia, okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your nice presentation. I just pay attention to the tonality that you have is just so amazing. I don't know if that's a nature or you worked on that, because the tonality of how you speak and how you pose, is it something, a skill that developed with?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, SFS, maybe it all started when I was at SFS. I don't know it, but it's part, when you start, and I must say, the first speeches I had to give, I was thrown into an event when I was an attaché. The others couldn't go and said, you get to go and speak. I was very nervous, and I don't think I spoke at all well. I think all my nervousness showed. But don't forget, I was 42 years, so I think over time you learn how to be like that. Although maybe not everyone does, because I think it's a very bad idea to simply have the text and read it. You have to look at the audience. You have to, it's various things that I think you learn by experience. But thank you very much. Any more? Over there.
What about negotiating the name of a country? And I'm thinking more like the North Macedonia dispute. I mean, how does diplomacy come into that? Because I believe that was a prolonged case. It's been going on for, I believe, like 20 years or 25 years. I believe it's a vexed issue that I think North Macedonia wanted EU accession.
Well, yes, it's a vexed issue, as you say. No, well, it's a very long issue, and it's very difficult to explain in just a few words. But the fact is that the Macedonia is a geographical region. About 60% is in Greece, 30% is in North Macedonia, and 10% is in Bulgaria, or slightly less. So Greece's position all through these years was that Macedonia as a geographical term should not be confused with political term. So if you have a state that is called Macedonia, it confuses with the geography. So that was the basic reason that Greece was opposed for so many years. I myself, as a diplomat, did not agree. I have to tell you, because well, it's again a long story, but this part was part of Yugoslavia. And for so many years it was called the Socialist Yugoslav People's Republic or something like that of Macedonia. So the name existed previously. So I, as a diplomat, was very much in favor of quickly solving the issue by North Macedonia, for example, by keeping the name, but the Greek politicians, here we go, it's the diplomats, it's the politicians that decide. And the public, it seems, the public also did not want the word Macedonia in the name of this country. Now, we thought that it would be better in general if it had another name, because, as I said, if a geographical name is given a state dimension, it may lead to other problems. For example, wanting to extend your borders into Greece, Macedonia, or Bulgarian Macedonia. So there was reasoning behind our thinking. I think our reasoning was that it would help stability in Southeast Europe if this state did not have the name Macedonia. And it could have the name, for example, I mentioned it when I at the Foreign Office, when I was a young diplomat, Vardar Republic, the river that runs through North Macedonia is Vardar. So it could have been called Vardar Republic, no problem. But the fact is that they wanted this name, so then finally the compromise was reached. And the compromise was reached due to the decisiveness of the foreign minister and the prime minister at the time. So you see, the diplomats, we were negotiating, we had our opinions, we did whatever we could, but no agreement could have been reached if it wasn't for the decision of the then foreign minister, Kodias, and then Prime Minister Tsipras. So they made the decision. And I think it's very important because it's an issue that, to my mind, as a diplomat, should not have caused so much trouble for so many years. But it's been resolved, and Greece is the #1 investor in North Macedonia. The tourism is booming from their side into Greece, so it's no longer a problem. It's something of the past. Please.
Yeah, what kind of reading you're doing? I mean, what kind of books or journal you're joining and you're reading? And what did you read recently?
Well, in terms of reading, I mentioned my father. He was a subscriber to The Economist. I mean, I'm not, I mustn't advertise, I'm in danger of advertising here. But my father was a subscriber to The Economist. So ever since my father was a subscriber, I'm reading The Economist. And so does my wife, who is also a diplomat. She's also an ambassador of Greece, and so does our son. So, but apart from that, we try to read important international journals, but a variety. Financial Times, Le Monde in France. In terms of reading books, and I very much believe in books, much more than in reading it Kindle or whatever. History, philosophy. But what I mentioned also in my speech, I adjust my reading according to where I'm serving. So, for example, when I was ambassador to Zimbabwe, I read history of Zimbabwe, but lots of literature. Zimbabwean literature, because I think in most countries, also in my country, lots of the literature is based on life experiences of the writers of literature, not of history. It's literature, novel. It's not what's the word? It's not fact. It's fiction. But still, you learn very much about the country. And I can say, for example, one of the books I read in Zimbabwe was Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Ndangaremba. And I learned so much about life in Zimbabwe under the whites, under the white rule, through this book. And I must say, it was her, it was another, she put another name, but obviously it was the writer herself, Tsitsi Ndangaremba, growing up under white supremacist rule in the early 70s. Zimbabwe became independent in April 1980. So yes, but as I said in my speech, the reading is vital, and I think, well, when I was in Brazil, I was reading exclusively Brazilian literature, poetry, and in Iran, I tried to. I even had a poetry teacher because of course my Farsi is very bad, but Iranian poetry, Persian poetry, is very philosophical. So and I think so. Well, thank you. Maybe in the future. Not at the moment. No. Thank you for your question. Thank you.
Ambassador, so during or formal or legal sessions, there are still times when diplomats can suppress their emotions and lash out or accusing someone else of something. Mm-hmm. How do you suggest dealing with the situation? Thank you.
How do I suggest what?
How do you suggest dealing with the situation?
If someone gets angry?
Well, accusing another diplomat of something ridiculous or...
Yes. Well, it definitely, you must not counter-accuse. You must try, if someone accuses or if a situation becomes very heated, the moment becomes heated, I think that a good diplomat should do everything to calm it down. So it's much easier to get into a shouting match than to be able to have some sort of understanding. So sometimes I was in such situations, so you try to explain that it's not like that. You try to explain patiently that this accusation does not exist. But to my mind, you have to explain patiently and with argumentation. Not always successful, but at least the tone, the atmosphere is improved. But it's not always, life is difficult. Women. And I very strongly support women in diplomacy. And my wife, for example, she's better than me. She's more professional than me, most definitely.
I have a question. May I? Okay. I actually have two very short questions.
Yes.
The talk is called What Makes a Good Diplomat? And you said that usually you are trying to be out of the office, meeting
Yes.
people. But definitely you spend some time in the office. I'm just curious what kind of tasks you usually put as a priority, because I'm sure it's not reading literature of the country. And second question...
Tasks in the office.
In the office, yeah.
Yes.
And second question, if you could choose any country in the world to go and be diplomat, what would be the country?
Greece. Yeah. And I think that's important, that this is an important question, because I've said it many times, including with my friends. I think it's very important that all of us are happy with what we are and where we are. So if I was a Greek diplomat and thinking to myself, it would be so nice to be a diplomat of a real power, of a big country, in Europe, let's say, or France or Spain. No, I'm happy because I'm a Greek diplomat, and all these years I've been serving my country. And as I said, the point of diplomacy is not only to pursue the interests of your country, but the interest of good relations with everyone. So in pursuing diplomacy and the interests of your country, you want to improve relations with all countries, you want to improve international understanding, and the goal, as I said, the main goal is international peace. So I think it's very important to be happy with who you are, with the country which you are. And this, because I discussed this many times, is also important locally. If people living in mountains wanted to live by the sea, and people who were living by the sea were saying, it would be so good if I was living in the mountain, no one would be happy. So I think it's good that we are happy with what we are and where we are. So the second question of tasks in the office, there are the daily tasks, for example, reporting, and we have to do that, and especially important events. Sometimes, if something is urgent or some big event occurs, which may be a political event, the president is overthrown, or it may be a natural event, a big earthquake, you have to report immediately. But many times the day-to-day tasks are not decided by you, as I said, as these examples show. It's decided by the situation of the day in the country. So yes, you plan and you give to your colleagues, you ask them to prepare certain reports on certain issues, so you definitely have plans and you do. But at the same time, many issues come up on a daily basis. And for example, even it happened to me many times, Greeks, when I was in Brazil. The capital is in Brasilia, sort of in the middle of nowhere. So in Brazil, because it's a huge country. So many times we had Greeks coming from Rio or somewhere else in Brazil after the embassy was closed. So no way you could say, sorry, the embassy is closed, come back. No, we let them in. You see, so that is something that you cannot predict, but Brazil is a huge country, so if I said no, it would mean that this person would have to find a hotel, change his flight, etc., etc. So many of our daily activities are once again determined by the situation outside, by the objective situation, not by our wishes.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your talk and insights. I would like to know, does a diplomat of a country needs to know every details of the conflict that country is involved, like past and current? If yes, to what extent?
Oh, like what influence?
If yes, to what extent? To what extent does a diplomat need to know the details of the conflict his or her country is involved, like in the current and
the
past?
conflicts.
Yeah, conflicts.
Yes. No, well, you have to know them. You have to know it well, because you have to know the reasons why it's involved. You have to know daily developments. It's something you have to follow very closely, because actually you have to follow very closely to be able to see also how you can change the situation, find a solution to the conflict, because any conflict, to my mind, is bad, and a prolongation of a conflict makes things worse for everyone. So actually, in conflict situations, our work is much more important and vital. And how can you say, without there's no way you can relax. You have to follow closely and try to find solutions.
Do you need to know all the details? Do you need to know all the details about Greece's conflicts all over the world, say in Japan, in the US?
Well, fortunately, we don't have conflicts. but you have to know. You have to know what your country is doing everywhere. Yes, of course, there's countries that are more in the spotlight, and others that are less. But as a diplomat of your country, you have to know the details of your country, especially as concerning foreign policy, because that, I think, is your question. What is Greece with Japan? What is Greece with Argentina? You have to know. You have to know. Yes. But there was a question here, I think, right? Yes, a question here, please, because she had raised her hand before.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question, but I wanted to underline something that you said a bit jokingly, I think, that when we have a sustained presence on the moon, and maybe potentially somewhere else, that we need diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And I think actually we need it right now, even because we are going towards that. So I think that's something really important that you mentioned. And my question is, if you could, of course, as a diplomat, you mentioned a lot that there's a big human element to your job.
Yes.
And as a human yourself, of course, you have ideas, you have thoughts, you have opinions.
Weaknesses.
And the most challenging part of your job, I would think, is that you have to be very careful what you say at what time. And like you said, it's a 24-hour job. It's not a 9 to 5. What are some practical skills that you've learned over the years in how to manage your own personal frustrations at times, or things that, managing as you learn about a new country and you see things unfold maybe in that country that you don't agree with, or things that you wish you could take a stand on maybe not officially, but how do you find an outlet for that? Because I imagine that could be a bit challenging.
If you're frustrated with developments in the country in which you're serving, in which you're working.
For example, in your former posting,
yes.
Or any of them.
Well, I don't know how exactly you do that, because definitely many times we're frustrated. We're frustrated all over. I think I mentioned in my speech, we're frustrated with our own governments, because we as diplomats know that something is good to do, but the government decides something else, and we have to do it. And in a country in which you're serving, you may see that many things are wrong, and you see it. I've seen it many times. In many countries, that the government of the day could just change something small, could just make a small change, and it would be so much better for everyone, and yet they don't do it. So many times I do express, with this frustration, my own personal opinion. So for example, it's difficult to tell a government or someone else what to do, as a Greek diplomat. But I can express my opinion as Dimitri, on a personal basis. And many times I do that, including in Iran, which was my last posting. I used to express my opinion as Dimitri, not as the ambassador.
Hello. I want to ask, how can you improve your understanding of the principle of soft power as a young diplomat who's just getting into the field?
And where are you from?
Nigeria.
Okay. Well, lots of soft power there. and also real power, oil power. But soft power is very important, and actually,
long time ago, by the way.
many times I think that big countries, strong countries, superpowers, if they put more attention on their own soft power, they will gain much more than with military power. I think you can see many examples. You can see the examples of countries that have conquered the world by soft power, even by things like pop music or genes. So I think that soft power is extremely important, and if politicians paid more attention to that, I think things would be much better.
What do you think the soft powers in the GCC countries? Soft power do they have in the GCC countries?
Well, for example, all the tourism and the beauty, lots of soft power, and yes. But I think there's others who have questions. You have a question?
Yes, Excellency. Thank you very much for the very insightful thoughts and
Thank
lectures.
you.
And I really share with you your principle about engagement doesn't mean agreement. And we always need to engage no matter what, even if we don't agree with the country that's receiving us.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I have a little, question
Yes.
about your presenting your personal opinions as a personal opinion.
Yes.
Because I think as long as you are on duty, with your still valid credentials, it can be a big scandal if you mention something in a personal way, unless otherwise it's like, Chatham House or something of the records.
No. Chatham House rules and so on is different. No, but on a situation, for example, in the foreign ministry, in the foreign ministry of a country, you are the ambassador, but you don't want to cause any misunderstanding, because if you express your opinion, it's what the previous question. If you think that for a country it would be good to do such and such a thing, if you say it as the ambassador of another country, it may be a bit, unacceptable for the other one. Are you trying to tell me what to do? But if you say it on a personal level as Dimitri, we are saying it as Dimitri. You see, that's the point. Your point is that, okay, you may say you're Dimitri, but you're the ambassador. But it's not exactly like that, because you make the distinction. And in fact, it's done very many times in our job. And we stress my personal opinion. Or I'm saying this on a personal basis.
Publicly?
No.
Okay, that's my question.
No.
That's my question.
No. Publicly.
Exactly. That's my question.
Yes. No. Publicly, no. Publicly, now that I'm retired. Yes, please.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your presentation. By listening to it, I learned that you come from a diplomatic family, so I'm pretty sure you grew up watching and looking closely to this craft as is diplomacy. Besides your father, who were the other diplomatic role models that you had, and what qualities you think shape the way you are a diplomat now?
My diplomatic what? Apart from my father, my diplomatic?
Other diplomats you recognize as role models that shape the way you are a diplomat now?
Well, I must say that there are a few younger Greek diplomats, because, for example, at the embassy in Washington, I was a student, as you know, at the time, and I used to have many discussions with the young diplomats at the embassy. And some of them were really good, and they influenced my thinking, yes. So I would say our diplomats, but then, well, it depends on the situation. I can say that I learned very much from British diplomats, you know, from French. It depends on the situation and on your personal relationships. But for example, and I've forgotten his name, you know, I'm very sad that I've forgotten his name. When I was in Zimbabwe, I had 3 British ambassadors. I was there quite some time. Now the first one, no, actually I had 2. I was there 3. The first one, he left. I was in the ambassador to Zimbabwe 2005 to 2007. And the first ambassador left shortly after I arrived, around 2005. And he told us, leaving, that it's very difficult to make predictions, you know, but I'm leaving. So I would, if I can say one thing, it would be keep your eyes focused on Mnangagwa, because then Mugabe was all powerful as the president. There was no, he was the leader. But he told us, you know, looking to the future, I would, you know, look at Mnangagwa, who is the present president. After Mugabe died and so on, and there were elections, this one. So this ambassador had predicted in 2005 who will be in power in so many years later. So, you know, I think the basic thing, as I said in my speech, is listen, because you cannot, it's very difficult to say. Now, of course, I have many people I can remember who influenced me, but I think the basic thing is to listen, because you can learn from everyone. So I basically learned very many things from many people. I cannot say there's one who has been the most influential, apart, of course, from my father.
I would like to ask, highlighting the point...
I cannot hear, actually.
Sorry. Yeah. Regarding the conflict, we see like the conflict between the countries is just keep like growing, and nothing seems to be solved. And I would like to ask, like, why is that? Is it because we are lacking good diplomats in the negotiation for the interests of the countries? Or what's your thoughts about this?
No, it is lack of political will. It is lack of political will. Because as I said, in order to get agreement and in order to get peace, let's say, not conflict, you have to have compromise. You have to give up certain things. You cannot get everything you want. And if there is no will to compromise, if you think that you can impose your point of view by military might, you're going to continue doing that if you think. But I think we've seen in history, and we've seen also very recently, that this is not a good solution. We see it in the, you know, every time someone imposes something militarily, a few years later, there's a problem again. The only lasting solution is negotiation and reaching agreements and keeping them. But unfortunately, many people think that might is right. You know, there is, going back again to ancient Greece and Plato, there is a dialogue, Gorgias, it's called Gorgias. And Gorgias is trying to prove to Socrates that might is right. And Socrates insists that right is might, that, you know, if you have your right on your side, if you are right, that's enough, that's your strength. But Gorgias is insisting, no, that's not enough. Might is what makes right. So our world would be much better if right was might. But unfortunately, we see it every day that many people think that might is right. It's not. It's not. but many people think it is, and they act on this basis, and that is part of the reason why we have all these conflicts. Well, I think we see it very in our wider neighborhood. When you use military to bomb and to destroy schools, hospitals, that's might. That's military might. But again, it's not right. They may think it's right, but it's not. Definitely not in the long term, as we have seen. Yes? Yes, okay, yes. Please.
And if so, what do you do in this situation? Do you follow your own morals based on your expertise and personal values, or do you just listen to the government? Thank you.
Well, you said goes against my principles as a human
Yes,
being. No, it's not exactly like that. It's not exactly like that. But it's instructions that you know are not good. So when you know, as it has happened to me very many times, that you know that the instructions are not good, and there is a reason for that, because the capitals, all our capitals, supposedly have the whole picture. Because, for example, when I was ambassador, let's say, again, to Zimbabwe, I knew the local situation very well, but my capital had information from all the embassies in Africa and the embassies in South America. So theoretically, our capital, Athens, has all the information. But in practice, you, the person on the ground, the person over there in Zimbabwe, I knew the situation much better. So many times you receive instructions that you know do not fit the local situation. So what you can do is call your capital and say, you know, this is not exactly, we should not do this exactly. One solution is this. The other solution that we do many times is we keep, this is a diplomatic trick, we keep the spirit of the instruction, but not the letter of the instruction. Because, you know, and I think, again, it's not a good diplomat, because it has happened. I had a boss. I had a boss who he had instructions, and when he went to the ministry, and I was a note taker, he insisted word for word upon the written instruction, the letter, and which were not good. And I was trying, you know, as a young diplomat, I was making motions and trying to signal that don't say it exactly like that, but he did. It wasn't good. But we have this leeway. We have this leeway to keep the spirit. We cannot ignore instructions, but we needn't repeat word for word exactly what they are. So there is a way around it. There is a way around it. And it's not a question of your conscience. No, it's not usually a question. It's not like that. It's a question of you being on the spot, knowing what is good to do, and your capital not being there, thinking that something else is good, but it's not. So there, as I say, there's two ways out. One is to call and to try to change the instructions. The other is to change them yourself, but not the spirit, but not to say them exactly, say it in a softer way or slightly different way.
Ambassador, thank you for your presentation. Obrigado. What's your tip for people who are learning the language, the country they are working in or working at? Just for curiosity, it's really common for me as a Brazilian, Portuguese-speaking person to be addressed in Spanish by people who are supposedly learning Portuguese. So what do you suggest to people who are learning the language? And yeah, thank you.
This is absolutely the worst, the worst. It was a big problem in Brazil because the Brazilians were saying, we understand our neighbors when they speak Spanish, but our neighbors do not understand us when we speak Portuguese. But actually, you didn't ask the right person, because when I was taking Portuguese lessons in Brazil and when I was taking Persian lessons in Iran, my teachers said the best way to learn a language is to see the telenovelas, the, what do you call these series? Yes, yes. Soap operas, yes. But I don't like them. So for me, it was very, I'm sorry to say, I don't like them. So it was very difficult. I tried. In Brazil, I tried. And my teacher in Iran, she was insisting, you know, if you see these things. And in Iran, actually, I did find some that were interesting, black and white, old ones. And so that's it. But actually, I have to say that the advice given by the language teachers is the best way is to watch these soap operas, because you hear it, and you hear expressions of the day and colloquial expressions. It's different to read a book which may be very sophisticated and so on. It's different to see a thing. And I think also you have to try, again, you didn't ask the right person, because I was shy. Until I thought that I knew the language pretty well, I was not speaking. Big mistake. When you learn a bit, you have to try to speak with the locals, because then slowly, your confidence, you make mistakes, obviously, but slowly, your confidence, you gain in confidence as you see that you're speaking more and more with the locals. So these are my advice. My advice is what I didn't do, but it's what I advise. To watch these soap operas and to speak as quickly as, to try speaking as quickly as possible. I'm sorry? For language? No. Yes, we follow all of these things. We have to, whether we like it or not, you know, we have to. It's part of our work. It's not a question of being smart. No, don't confuse two things. It is one thing following or seeing some things on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. It's a different issue. Retweeting or believing it. Maybe I should have said that in my speech, that we have to judge the information we receive. Is it fake? Is it true? So we cannot, I think you have to follow all sources of information, but then it's up to you how you judge it or how you use it. But I think, well, I have time if someone wants to. I don't know if we have time. You're the library?
Maybe 2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions, yes. It's a lovely setting, huh? This library, lovely setting.
Okay,
Where are you from? Where do you think? That's not a question. That's a diplomatic. No, my aunt. That's another thing. If you ask, why do you always ask so many questions? Do you know what the reply to that is? Why not? Yes, some do. I didn't. Yes. Some were very active, including in Iran, which was my last posting. Some ambassadors were very active. I was not, because again, it goes to what the other colleague said about personal, you know, there may be confusion between your own personal account and so on, so I did not do that. But anyway, well, yeah, maybe. But we have time for 2 more questions, I think.
Hello, there's just a short question. Do you believe the United Nations is useful, or international organizations in general?
Yes, they are useful. Of course, they don't have, you know, the UN has as much power as it's given by its members. And the UN doesn't have an army. The UN has a very limited budget. Actually, what is very interesting, because I served also at the UN, the peacekeeping budget of the UN for peacekeepers is about, I forget now, 7 times more than the budget of the UN as an organization. So there's many problems with the UN. We think it's ineffective, but the UN is very important. It's very important because it's a forum for international discussion, and of course, they do lots of work on the ground. even if these days we see more and more problems, for example, for the relief and the UN Relief and Works Administration, for some of the peacekeepers, but they do lots of work on the ground. So I think the UN is vital. And the international organizations in general are good because it puts nations together and they have to try to agree something in common. So I'm very much supportive of especially the UN, but in general international organizations. Is that it? Is there someone else? No, okay. So last question.
Sorry, I asked so many, but since nobody wants to ask a question, I will. I want to ask for the diplomats. So what is his leverage? Is only take the agenda and go negotiate the agenda and get back to us, and we will tell us the feedback, and then we will tell you what to do next negotiation? Or he has not the power, he has like the right to negotiate the agenda that will help to negotiate with the other party, like before going into the ground and discuss with the other party.
Yes, you can do that.
Yeah, you do.
Yes, it's both. It's both these things you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
One thing is negotiating and then returning to your government saying what progress was made or what progress was not made,
Mm-hmm.
and request fresh instructions. Another aspect is you proposing an agenda. I did that as a young diplomat in Norway because the diplomat was going to Athens for political talks, but diplomatic talks. So to my capital, being in Norway, the ambassador was away. So as a young diplomat, but in Norway, I suggested to my ministry what the agenda should be, because from my point of view in Oslo, and that was kept. So it's both. No, we have quite a lot of leeway, but we always have to be careful. It's as I say, these words, careful, balance, patience, all of these is count. Okay, but thank you very much for your questions, and thank you. Thank you.